Hello, my name is Will DiGravio, and welcome to On Your Screen, a new offshoot of the Video Essay Podcast. Now, you may be asking yourself, what is On Your Screen? That, my friend, is a great question. Long story short, as we've all lived these many long months now, over a year in quarantine, I think all of us who appreciate the moving image and its many forms have consistently turned to our computer screens for entertainment, to connect with other people, to seek out new things that stimulate us intellectually, that bring us joy, what have you. We've seen film festivals and museums and artists make the most of quarantine and bring their work to us in new ways. I can think of no better example than my first film, which is the work of Zia Anger, that began as a in-person live performance desktop documentary, and then in the middle of quarantine morphed into a live streamed desktop documentary that brought people together from all over the world. At the heart of the Video Essay Podcast is an interest in screens and what our relationship is with screens. And it's becoming ever more intimate by the day, and especially as the pandemic continues on. And so this podcast is meant to bring you short conversations, hopefully no longer than 40 or so minutes, with people who are doing exciting and interesting things in the digital film ecosystem, moving image ecosystem on screens. And so today's guest is Michael Temple, who is the director of the Essay Film Festival, which this year will be done completely online. The guests on this show, I'm sure, will vary. The goal is to highlight certain things that are happening online that you should not miss, that you should go check out. So I imagine it will be a lot of festival coverage or various one-off screenings that I'll attempt to preview and highlight. But perhaps we'll have someone come on to discuss a work that maybe doesn't fit the Video Essay Podcast and the more formulaic approach that I take there in my conversations with guests, and we'll want to have them on Your Screen is the offshoot's name. So I'm very excited about this new endeavor. I am open to suggestions of all forms. I want to play around in this format and really, see what comes of it. And I have this podcast feed. I have a wonderful audience in all of you. So this is just my way of giving you more great stuff, hopefully. And it's also an outlet for me to pursue many of my own interests. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Michael, who thought he was being interviewed for the Video Essay Podcast. So if we refer to the Video Essay Podcast in the conversation, that is why. A big thank you to Michael for agreeing to talk with me and then waiting for me to release our conversation so that I could debut it on this as the first episode of On Your Screen. And please don't forget to check out the Essay Film Festival, which begins on March 25th. And you can find more information about the Essay Film Festival at essayfilmfestival.com. And now here's my conversation with Michael Temple. I am now very pleased to be joined by Michael Temple, who is a reader in film and media in the School of Arts at Birkbeck, University of London. He is also the director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Moving Image and the Essay Film Festival. Michael is someone who I reached out to maybe a week before fleeing the UK due to coronavirus, just before the 2020 iteration of the festival, which unfortunately was canceled due to COVID. But this year, the festival is taking place remotely online. And so I'm very pleased to finally be able to sit down here with Michael to discuss the Essay Film Festival. Welcome, Michael, to the Video Essay Podcast.
Thanks, Will. It's nice to have a chance to talk about what we do.
In that vein, could you provide a general overview or history of the Essay Film Festival, and what is the festival's mission?
Okay, so we started in 2015 was the first edition. So we agreed to launch this festival in 2014, and obviously we worked on it for a good sort of 9 months or so running into it the first time. The origins of the festival are actually quite simple. On the one hand, obviously a lot of the work we do at BIMI, Birkbeck Institute for the Moving Image, where, as you may know, Will, we have this really beautiful little cinema in the middle of Bloomsbury in central London, which is where I work at Birkbeck. And so my role as director of BIMI has essentially to program that cinema in relation to, in a research context, if you like, what I would call a research context. So I work with scientists, philosophers, historians, sociologists, all sorts of different people, and we try and do interesting and original things in the cinema around ideas and discussions and so forth. So in many ways, it's important for me to say that my job at BIMI is nothing to do with film studies as a discipline. It is very much about public engagement and sharing all the different types of research that we do in different disciplines, but using the cinema as a kind of, not just a space, a showcase. It's really important for me. It's not a showcase, it's a laboratory. So my idea is that in the cinema space, something can, this is my hypothesis, if you like, is that my idea is that in the cinema space, something can happen. Actually, something happens in that space, which is to do with projection, it's to do with material, it's to do with the people, it's to do with the audience, it's to do with the ideas. But it's a moment, it's an event that happens in the cinema space, which is not just about someone standing up saying, this is my research, I'm going to show you a movie, or saying, here's a movie, and now I'm going to tell you about my research. So it's actually the idea, I think, deep down, Laura Mulvey, who's my colleague at Birkbeck and my predecessor at BIMI, I think that something that we share is this idea that the cinema space can actually be a kind of I call it a laboratory. It probably sounds a bit pretentious, but a kind of a space in which ideas and things and moments can actually emerge, which wouldn't happen if we didn't make that effort. So in that sense, it's a kind of a gambit in terms of research. And so out of that, I think when we talked about doing a festival, I think the essay film is kind of that, because the essay film is experimental, but it's also absolutely addressed towards the real. So, for me, people say to us about, the essay film, is it this, is it that? And I have quite strong feelings about this in a way, but they're very simple feelings, which I think is that in some ways, I think academic discourse has largely done a disservice to the essay film, because it has to treat it in terms of categories and genres. Essay film is not a genre, you know what I mean? And in terms of defining things, and then it gets kind of all very, whereas, it seems to me that, the essayistic, if you think about history, writing, photography, all sorts of different moving image cultures. The essayistic is a way of being in the world. It's not even just a way of thinking about the world, it's a way of being in the world. And so you have to start from that point of view, that it's to do with a kind of a mode of being and a mode of cinema. It's not about a genre that you define by saying, you have this or you have that form or quality. And I think the other way that's really important to think about the essay film is that for me, it's like kind of the crossing point between the experimental and the documentary. So if you think of documentary, again, is a mode. It's not a genre, or it's to do with a desire. What shall I do with cinema? I want to engage with the world. I want to investigate the world. I want to confront problems in the world. I want to talk about history, society, and politics. However, as we know, documentary tends to be formally quite conservative and conventional. And in fact, I would say documentary is blind to form, because it tends to work in terms of format rather than form, particularly obviously in television, but really the vast majority of documentaries that go under that name do not actually think about form. So obviously if you then turn to the experimental tradition, obviously the experimental tradition is all about thinking about form and language and asking questions about the means of cinema, the technique of cinema, the possibilities of cinema. So if you cross those two, if you think of a kind of a Venn diagram where the kind of what I call the curiosity that's part of documentary, and then the kind of inventivity or reflexivity that's part of the experimental, when they cross over, I would say that's an essayistic space. And so really that can be in writing or photography or anything, but I think it's very clear for us that in terms of film and the moving image, there's a moment when those two sensibilities, those two desires fuse, if you like, they come together and they make something happen. And that's what I think of as being the essayistic.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And I think listeners of this show will know that so many of the questions that you're raising there and in the way that you're thinking about essay film, but also the role of the Birkbeck Institute, the Moving Image, where you are bridging gaps between the public and an academic institution and really trying to create this laboratory of sounds and images, very, very much in line with a lot of what video essayists are trying to do online. In particular, I would say academic video essayists. The essay film as a form or as a idea, as you've alluded to, incredibly rich, varied. It might be more prudent to ask what an essay film can be rather than what an essay film is. But could you expand, I guess, a little bit to provide a little bit more of a definition, and perhaps a definition is impossible, but I guess an overview of the kinds of works that you typically screen at the festival and how those feed into the genre, the feed into what an essay film is, or how you think of an essay film.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be precious about this, Will. I mean, people can call it what they like. People can call it a genre. They can call it whatever they like. I don't really mind. But I mean, in terms of our way of thinking about it, I think that we feel that that's not necessarily the best way that we want to think about it. We want a way of thinking about the essayistic in film and media, which is very inclusive and very, very supple, but at the same and dynamic, if you like. But really, the two qualities we're looking for are precisely what I've just said: a kind of a passion about the real world, a passion about cinema's ability to engage with the real world, but at the same time an awareness of questions of form and language, and to be able to think through those two things together. So, you'll always find at the margins of documentary people who are very interested in form, and documentary over the history of cinema has been much more probably inventive than people give it credit for. And similarly, you could argue that experimental cinema is sometimes maybe over preoccupied with questions of form and language, in a sense, for itself. And so I think what we find is exciting is when those two things come together. So in terms of the sort of films that we have programmed over the years, so just to go back a little bit to the history, 2015 was our first year. So this would be our 7th edition. If 2020 hadn't been cancelled, then this upcoming one would be our 7th, I think. Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at what we've done, anyone who wants to look on the Essay Film Festival website can see the history of what we've done. You just click and you can see each year. I think that pretty much everything we've ever shown has that kind of that double edge, that kind of double desire, double sensibility. So you will have things which are, what I would think of as being found footage, essentially. I mean, for me, this question about the video essay, for me, the video essay is kind of a subcategory of the category that I would call found footage in terms of the history of cinema. So it's become very popular and very important, and particularly, as you just said yourself, it's something that's been proved incredibly popular amongst researchers and academics above all. And obviously, it's cinema thinking about cinema. It's film thinking about film. It's what I would call probably the audiovisual criticism or the audiovisual history of cinema. And so for me, the video essay is a part of that. And it happens to be a part that's become, obviously, lots of people are doing it. It works incredibly well in a teaching context. I think a lot of people have told me, or people around me have used it in teaching context, and they find that students are much more able to think critically, analytically when they're doing things with the images themselves and working with sound and so forth. So I think that, for me, it's a very interesting development. And in fact, in this country, I mean, probably the person who really started doing this in an academic context before anybody else was Michael Witt. He was doing this at Roehampton, which is a university near London. I mean, God knows how many years ago. I can't remember. I mean, back when we did Forever Godot at Tate Modern, probably he was already doing it then. So that was the turn of the century. So he was really sort of getting the students to work critically, analytically, things which they maybe didn't really want to do anymore in the kind of traditional way of doing film analysis. And so, I mean, Mike is someone for whom I have immense respect and admiration, and he did, he was doing that, and then little by little, it became, people. I think it was as these things emerge, Will. I mean, around the world, suddenly there are lots of different people who realize they're doing the same thing. So then they start talking to each other and getting together, and obviously my other reference in the UK world obviously is Katie Grant, who until recently was my colleague at Birkbeck and is still very close to us and close to BIMI and close to the festival. And obviously she kind of took that and ran with it and really, set up these referee journals and all sorts of things that obviously have made it a very respectable, recognizable part of academic discourse, rather than it being something which was maybe seen as being round the edges, maybe a little bit kind of a little bit different, a little bit strange. It's become very, very mainstream now, which I think is an entirely healthy thing. I mean, I do think that particularly not just for undergraduate students, but I mean, students at all levels, it provides other ways of doing stuff. But in terms of the Essay Film Festival, as I say, I think our position is a much broader position around the essayistic in film and media, of which the video essay would be part of the found footage kind of. So if you look back through our programs, the first year we were incredibly lucky to get Tom Anderson. So we got Tom Anderson's latest film. I mean, I think we were probably the second place in the world to show it when we showed it in London that year. The Thoughts That Once We Had. So, that was and so we had a whole thing around Tom Anderson, and he was in London with us. And, so that was, and you can see Peter von Bach the first year, and you could follow a line through the programming, which would be that kind of, found footage, including the things we've done on the video essay. But for me, that would be one of the kind of streams, because obviously that is the side of, this is when the essay film is thinking about the means of cinema through the means of cinema, but not in a kind of sort of circular manner, where it for me, unless there is also that sense of thinking about the world. So it's kind of my definition is something. I've sometimes used this phrase about a critical take on the forms of cinema and the world in which cinema takes place, or something like that, some kind of variant on that. So if there isn't, or for us, say, if there isn't that political engagement, that critical engagement with the world, then I think the film about film can become, I think, rather sterile, personally. And for me, there's no point in the essayistic unless it's political. And, just to give you an example completely from nothing to do with cinema, I mean, during lockdown, I found this amazing volume of all of the essays of James Baldwin. Like it was a kind of Library of America is the publisher, and it was this incredible chronological order, every essay that Baldwin had ever written. So it was a way of kind of going through his whole, and I read it in sequence all the way through. And that is a model. If you want a model of what I understand by the essayistic, you just read those James Baldwin essays all the way through, because there is the reflexivity, there is the curiosity about language and about form, but there's this urgency of the political, and the danger, the sense of danger that you get in Baldwin, and the sense of the danger in which he is constantly, existential danger, that he manages to convey so well. But the ability to think about politics, to think about popular culture, to think about history, to talk about cinema, poetry, whatever. For me, that really is, that's a model which I knew about vaguely, but I sat down and read it from page 1 to page 1,000 or whatever it was, and that really confirmed everything that I think about the essayistic, and I think for us that's super important. So, I mean, Tom, for example, Tom's work and Red Hollywood and obviously Los Angeles Plays Itself, and this is never it's never a kind of a self-indulgent thing about, I'll make a movie about movies, and there is always this very kind of hard edge, critical edge to what he's doing. So, I mean, that's kind of like one of the things that we've done. But I would also argue that if you and your listeners look at the program since 2015, you'll also find there are things which are, much closer to what some people might say, hey, this is just a documentary, or just a kind of a politically engaged documentary. So for me, the other kind of absolute reference point for me personally is Justine Saab. So 2017, Justine's no longer with us. Unfortunately, she passed away a couple of years ago. But, for me, Justine Saab is an absolute reference point around the essayistic, because this was a woman who was from Lebanon, working in Lebanon, doing essentially TV reporting about her own country. And when the civil war blew up, she just at some point more or less said, I can't do this anymore. I can't do this. This form is not adequate for what I have to do in this urgent moment when my whole society, my life, my city is just blowing up around me and everyone's kind of killing each other. And the politics is just incredibly messy and complicated. And so she started doing things differently. And she made these amazing films about Beirut, which we called the Beirut Trilogy. But she said she quite liked that idea of calling it the Beirut Trilogy. And, these are films that are absolutely made in the urgency and the danger of the moment. And they have to be inventive, Will, not to make them look nice or to be clever, but they have to be inventive because they can't be any other way. To respond to such a dramatic situation where everything is falling apart, you have to be inventive as well. You have to think about form. And it might seem odd to people, oh, why would you be thinking about form in the middle of a civil war? Well, that's exactly the moment when you would be thinking about form. And for me, from in terms of academic references or whatever, this is where someone like Nicole Brenez, with whom obviously I've had dealings over the years and someone for whom I have enormous respect, that's precisely the kind of, in essence, that's kind of her position, which is she would claim experimental cinema is the most political form of cinema. And I don't have to agree with her. That doesn't matter. But I think the statement is strong and the statement is worth thinking about. And I would say certainly when you think about the essayistic, the kind of the documentary end of the essayistic spectrum, and you take for example someone like Justine, then you have that sense of urgency, but the invention is a necessary step at that moment in time, and it has to be what it is at that moment in time. And it may not be very pretty, it may not be very, it may be a mess. But again, the essayistic is happy to be a mess. The essayistic is about making mistakes and getting things wrong, which is obviously, again, I suppose another kind of reference for me that we've never touched in the festival, but it's always in the back of my mind. It's a very sort of Godardian position. It's that the mess and errors and mistakes are and things that are incomplete. That's kind of what an essayistic practice could be. So there's a lot of material, if people wanted to look through it, that I would say, you could see those two key aspects or drivers, if you like, of the essayistic. If you think of some of the other things that we're showing this year, like, for example, Colleen Smith or Kevin Jerome Everson, for example, these are films which are absolutely experimental in their sensibilities and their sense of the possibilities of film as a form, and the sense how simple it is to be experimental. That being experimental is not, in a sense, being unnecessarily complicated and obtuse. It's actually very simple, which is another very Brenesian idea to me, that the experimental is the most simple, fundamental thing, really. But they're obviously, if you look at Colleen Smith's work or Kevin Jerome Everson's work, these are films that are absolutely, or with this work that is absolutely engaged with the everyday, with the real, but obviously a real that is haunted by history. By history, obviously, in the specific case of Kevin Jerome Everson and Colleen Smith, by a particular sense of African American history and how that lives in the present. But it wouldn't. It wouldn't have to be that. It could be something else. And I think in a sense this would be another kind of strain of the essay film festival programming that you could follow from 2015 through to the present is attempts to re-engage with history and to bring the historical into the present, not as nostalgia but as something new. So it's about reinventing a form in the present and bringing something into the present that it can speak to the now, or at least it can attempt to make something connect to the now, if you like.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And I think I'm a huge fan of Kevin Jerome Everson, as I'm sure many people listening are, so I'll be looking forward to that. And you touched on a very important point that I think is particularly relevant to this podcast and listeners, and that is this difference between the essay film and the video essay, right? That the essay film is not just some longer version of the video essay, but is thinking about politics, the world. But in talking about curation and giving this overview of the films that you select, one thing that I've encountered in curating video essays or works under the banner of video essay, whether with Kevin B. Lee and Sidney Wild-Harris for the Black Lives Matter video essay playlist and screening that at festivals, or even working in something like the Sight and Sound poll, is that inevitably you are, because these forms that you can't pinpoint down one specific definition, you are inevitably bringing in the work of video artists, of found footage filmmakers, of essay filmmakers, and then bringing them under one banner. And I imagine in hearing you describe how the various films that you've screened over the years and that you're screening this year is that you are seeking out films that were made in a variety of different contexts, and that perhaps the filmmaker was not saying, oh, I'm going to set out to make an essay film, right? I guess, how do you frame that? And are the artists, assuming they're still living, are they receptive to the tradition that you're trying to associate them with, or is it not something that they really question?
I don't know. I think there have been different responses over the years to that. I mean, I think that most artists don't necessarily care. In a good way. I mean, for good reasons. They don't necessarily care that much about how people describe what they do. So yeah, I mean, we've had people. Obviously, Justine would be a very good example, Justine Saab. But when Donald Foreman came to show his amazing film, The Image You Missed. I remember when Andres Di Tella came from Argentina to show his film, The 327 Notebooks. A lot of people have said with a smile, they've said, oh, I didn't know I was an essay filmmaker until you told me, Michael, which obviously we can, that's fine. And obviously some people would probably situate themselves more. They might say that they were experimental filmmakers or political filmmakers or whatever. I mean, so we don't really care that much. I mean, I think that, if you like, we just wanted to kind of set out a terrain in which we wanted to work and we wanted to experiment, and we felt it was very appropriate for the things that we were interested in. So that obviously, not everything I've said would be said by anybody else in the group. So as you probably know, and people can see this again on the website, that there are people at Birkbeck like Laura Mulvey, Catherine Grant, formerly Janet McCabe, obviously Matthew Barrington, who is an incredibly important figure in absolutely everything that we do. So he is officially the BIMI manager, but really he is a film curator and an incredible film curator. And his knowledge and contacts have been absolutely indispensable over the years. And there's Ricardo Matos Cabo, who is a friend, and he also is studying at Birkbeck, but he is an independent film curator of incredible experience and stature. There's Kieran Corliss, who's the deputy editor of Sight and Sound, and then in more recent times, we've been joined by Raquel Moraes, who is of Portuguese film curator, researcher, who has kind of joined our team. She was actually an intern, and then she just simply stayed in our team. So, I mean, people have, we know the kind of things that we want to program, but I mean, another very common question that people ask us is, why don't we have a kind of a competition or a submission process? And really, to be honest with you, it's not necessarily that we don't want to, but we're a very small operation, and no one is really paid as such to work on the Essay Film Festival. I mean, it's considered part of my job, it's considered part of Matthew's job, but it's not like a kind of it's not my job title. I don't get paid specifically for doing that. So we don't really have an infrastructure where, we could then put out a call every year, and by a certain date, people would send in films, because obviously then you'd have to to be respectful, you'd have to manage that process and administer that process, make sure that the films were all watched very carefully, the notes were taken, people were told whether their work had been accepted and why. So we've always had a much kind of more, you could say, improvised or organic approach, which is that every year we simply find enough material that we're interested in showing. And our criteria are also, from the beginning, we really wanted to do two things in terms of our kind of mission, or whatever you want to call it. One was the idea that the essayistic was something that was a global phenomenon. In other words, that again, if you look at the work we've done over the years, you can see that we have had work from pretty much, you should never say everywhere, because obviously then someone can point out an exception, but we wanted to take essayistic work from, whether it be Asia, whether it be Latin America, whether it be Africa, whether it be Eastern Europe or whatever, because I suppose there's a kind of expectation when you read about the essay film, people tend to think very much kind of Western European, North American are the obvious names that people often turn to. And so there was that we wanted to do, and I think we have done that. And the other thing that's really important, Will, is that there is always a mixture of the contemporary and the archival. And again, if you look through our programs, you can see we have always had work that we go and look for from the past. And we say, if you want to look at this and think of it as being essayistic, even if it wasn't called that at the time, why don't we do that? So that might be, S for Shub. Famously, the first year we did this whole kind of thing around S for Shub, and the idea being that you can reinterpret her work as being critical found footage work, critical engagement with the language of film and the world in which cinema, the world that cinema inhabits. And there would be other many other examples like that. We did a thing on essayistic work being done in public television in West Germany, for example, in the early 70s. People are like Farocki and so forth. So we always have this archival element. So this year, for example, the Med Hondo and the Sidney Sakona are obviously archival, and also Asia Djebar. So Asia Djebar, obviously better known as a novelist, as a kind of one of the kind of key women novelists of kind of of Francophone North Africa. But she made, it so happens that she made a couple of films, and one of them we're going to be showing this year, which is called it's called The Zerda and the Songs of Forgetting. Zerda and the Songs of Forgetting, which is is very much a kind of a critical essay based on reworking and reinterpreting footage that was shot during the colonial period in Algeria. And it's so that is again it's a very, I'm sure she wouldn't have said at the time that she was making an essay film, and she probably wouldn't have cared, which is fine. But it's something that we can kind of reclaim and then sort of present it in the context of the essay film, and then I think people can look at things differently if it's in that context. So the contemporary and the archival, to bring those together, and also the idea of work from different parts of the world. That those are really always our two main ambitions.
Final question here, because I think you've given us a great taste of the different kinds of works that will be at the festival, and that is, what can festival goers expect this year? Could you give us just a brief overview about how the festival will be operating online?
Absolutely, yeah. So, in terms of content, I'd invite people to look on the program. But in addition to the ones I've mentioned, we have contributions from Madeleine Hunt-Ehrlich. We have John Janvito's latest film. We have a film by Nuria Jimenez called My Mexican Pretzel. We have a whole thing with an Irish artist called Jenny Brady, who is showing some of her own films, curating some films with other people, doing a lecture about her ongoing work. We have the final day, we have a study day around Eduardo Coutinho, the Brazilian filmmaker. with various elements throughout the whole day. And then we also have this program of films that were actually curated by the Asian Film Archive in collaboration with Kevin Bealey. And this is this kind of package of films called under the title Monograph. So there are, I think, 10 different artists that were commissioned by the Asian Film Archive. And then Kevin came in on the project as a kind of a advisor. So that gives you an idea, I think, of the range of material that we'll be showing. In practical terms, we've gone down the path. I mean, we thought long and hard about it. We've gone for the model where pretty much everything will be available between the 25th of March and the 3rd of April. Some films we had to negotiate, and it had to be a smaller window, but we thought the best thing is to put everything on our screening room, which we've created, so that people can watch it when it suits them during that period of time. And then the live events are, so this is the talks, the conversations, etc. These are happening at a specific moment in time. So you have to book for those specific events, and then you receive a link, and then we don't use Zoom, but it's a similar kind of platform. So those things will be happening at a specific moment, but otherwise the film material will be available through our screening room pretty much from the beginning of the festival to the end, with one or two exceptions. So people who go onto the website can see, obviously, in more detail. But I think we've been very conscious. I think we're learning from the experience of other festivals online. We found that, say 6 months ago, when you looked at some of the online festivals, it was incredibly complicated to understand exactly what you were getting and when and why. And similarly, I think we felt that there was something very attractive about the idea of doing live streaming, but on balance, we felt that it was probably better to, rather than say this film will be shown at 6 o'clock on Friday and that's it. We felt that it was in the round, it was better to make things available, because obviously, it's kind of one of the advantages of doing an online festival. And I mean, I hope sincerely that we will do it this year online, and next year we'll be back in our cinema, in other cinemas in London. Like we've always worked with the ICA, as you know, in London, but equally with the French Institute, the Goethe Institute, Close Up, to be back in real cinemas. But I mean, obviously, we once you're going to do a festival online, you've got to try and embrace it and try to make it as good an experience as possible. And I think also this is why we wanted it to be practically as simple as it could possibly be. So if you go to our website, the first thing we do is explain in sort of like 2 very short paragraphs, how does it work? How do you watch the films? How do you attend the live events? Because, there's just so that there isn't this kind of uncertainty. Oh, I have to watch it on a Thursday, or I've got 24 hours to watch it, or whatever. Because I mean, there's so much online content, and people are so busy, and people have got caring responsibilities and all sorts of things like that to think about work and so forth. So on balance, we've gone for that formula.
And the how the festival work online, correct me if I'm wrong, is that all the films will be free and open to anyone in the UK, but the live events will be open to a global audience. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can probably understand why. Obviously, if in an ideal world, everything would have been available to everybody. But you've got to think in terms of the people who the distributors and the artists. If we are paying them a certain fee for the film to come at our festival, and then that they want to be able to also to show it at a festival in France or Italy or Argentina or whatever. So you're right. The film content is limited to the United Kingdom. It is absolutely free. I mean, we don't charge for anything. And again, that's, I suppose, is one of the small advantages, is that if we were working with a commercial cinema such as the ICA, obviously people would have to pay to come to the screening. So everything is free in the monetary sense. It is open to all, but the films are geo-blocked, whereas the live events obviously are not. There would be no reason to geo-block the live events, and obviously they are free as well. We don't tend to charge anyway with the things we do at Birkbeck or Bimmy. I've hardly ever charged for things in the past, and in a sense, it's part of our mission as a as a university, but also Birkbeck has a very specific history that you might know about, but it's very much about opening up education. It's very much about lifelong learning, and about, I know inclusivity is become a bit of a dull word to use, but I mean that is what Birkbeck is about, is quality education and research, but very much with the doors wide open, if you like.
Well, I know that all of our UK listeners, I'm sure, will be tuning into the SA Film Festival, and I hope that the audiences around the world will tune into the live events, or at the very least, take a look at the program and perhaps try and seek out the films to watch them in other contexts, keep them on your radar, and wait for them to come to your country. Michael Temple, thank you so much for joining us on the Video Essay Podcast. And again, you can learn more about the SA Film Festival at safilmfestival.com, but I will have links to the festival at thevideoessay.com, and we'll, of course, be retweeting and tweeting about the festival as it happens. So please follow the Video Essay on Twitter or the Birkbeck Institute of the Moving Image on Twitter for more information. Michael, thank you.
Thank you very much, Will.